Good morning, everybody. The time is 6:21 a.m. and today's game is Aquanaut's Holiday: Memories of 1999. This is one of the most vaporwave titles that you can probably play on the PlayStation 1, which is saying something. This is made by Artdink, who, depending on the circles you run in, is either known for experimental, weird art games, true to their name, or kusoge, shit games that are intolerable to play. Or I guess if you run in different circles, known really for simulation games. I wanted to play this today just because I've had a couple of games on my mind. I have been reviewing two games, VR adjacent games, I guess you could say. They both have VR modes, but you can just play them as regular games with controller. I've been playing Falcon Age, and sort of relevant to this one, Jupiter and Mars. Falcon Age is an anti-colonialist kind of story-focused game about a bond between a native character and her falcon and fighting against colonial oppressors, who are all robots, by the way. So robotic colonial oppressors come to take their planet, and kind of what it means to fight against a colonial ideology. And then Jupiter and Mars on the other side is, I guess, the quick and dirty pitch is Child of Eden meets Echo the Dolphin. It's a basically environmentalist style game where you explore the ruins of humanity as two different dolphins in like this very almost neon art style. It's really gorgeous, and there's just like a very nice electronic soundtrack to go along with it. Unfortunately, both of those games are nowhere near as exciting as their pitches. I'm sorry to say, mostly because, to put it crudely, they feel too much like video games. They're very much littered with kind of they're basically like overshadowed by the specter of modern game design. And I don't mean that in that modern game design is just inherently bad, but I mean that in a way that it kind of works within the tropes of modern game design without really considering what its elements do or say. Let's start with Falcon Age, since I finished that one and my review's up. My thoughts are a little bit more clear on that one. The problem with that game is that inexplicably, it feels like an open world game that was cut down to a bunch of almost dungeon-like small areas connected with very narrow and limited paths. It's got like a big elaborate side quests system that really is only a handful of quests that you complete for other people. There's somehow crafting in it, and to the point where there's so many items to craft from the different things that you can scavenge and hunt, and animals that you can hunt, that some of them really feel like they serve no purpose. There's like a stealth enhancement that you can cook for your falcon. In a game that never asks you to ever do stealth or indicates that that's a thing that's even possible. Looks like I crashed into the seafloor there. Gotta be a little bit more careful with the sub. Not that it's gonna explode or anything if I crash it too much. Yeah, inexplicably it's got that. There's also a system for growing vegetables and plants that I don't understand why it's in there. There's some thought given to the the ideas of reclaiming the land from the kind of colonialist, industrial domination. But really what it amounts to is there's a single 2x2 plot of land that you can grow like 4 vegetables in, which you're never going to need to use because none of the things that you cook are particularly useful or needed. And there is, I guess there is a version of that game that has these kind of open world mechanics in the same way and engages with them that could speak to its themes. Open world games are generally very colonialist in nature. They're very much about dominating and subjugating a land and making it more, homogenizing it and making it more convenient for you, and often also having it generate resources for you passively, right? And combining that with a game that's with a message that's very anti-colonialist seems like pretty ripe for exploration. Something that would, a pairing that could kind of say something on both sides. There's not that much thought into it. It really just feels like a game that started off way too big and was cut down to fit, into the size of and scope of something that they could actually ship, which is really unfortunate because it seems like exactly the kind of thing that I'd want to see in a game, but it's just not there. And then on the other side, Jupiter and Mars, which I've also been playing. Ooh, look at this fish. Oh, I love the fish in this game. Jupiter and Mars, which I've also been playing, suffers from a different kind of problem in which its spaces are small and controlled and kind of directed, which generally works, but then they feel this need to give you kind of video gamey objectives to... Oh, hang on. Oh, my bad. I wonder... Not to get distracted for a second, but... you might see these pulses here. These are all mapped to the shoulder buttons on this PlayStation 1 controller. They will do different interactions with the fish. Yeah, anyway, Jupiter and Mars very much is that directed experience, but it almost feels like it could stand to be a little bit more directed. It suffers from kind of giving you video game-ish objectives, so you would just kind of, like the first one is this very on-the-nose objective where you meet a mother turtle and then you have to save 5 turtles from plastic wrap, right? Oh, I'm sorry, little fishy. Yeah, which is like, you basically just go around the environment and click on 5 turtles, right? Really kind of disappointing. That's a little marker there. Really kind of disappointing approach to that space, which is fine, gives you an excuse to explore space, things like that, and I kind of understand that a little bit more. Another problem they have is they just kind of put collectibles everywhere, and it feels really ill-advised, kind of both from what the game's trying to achieve, but also just thematically that feels inconsistent. It just kind of feels like they put collectibles in the space to give you things to interact with, to make it feel interactive, so to say. Right, because that's a thing that video games have in their spaces, just so you just do, as a cheap way to kind of activate them, right? And for a game that's very much about appreciating like the beauty of nature and things like that, and kind of given its thematic aims, it feels really misguided, because not only do the collectibles kind of just turn each space into something where you're just hunting and pecking through random garbage to get collectibles that do nothing, they're often also just, they're not unique collectibles, they don't have any storytelling purposes. You just literally, it just gives you something to click on and then maybe be rewarded with. There's an echolocation system, which is used to a pretty good aesthetic effect and lets them do a lot with like darkness and color. And instead it turns into this sort of detective vision where you're just trying to find all the things you can click on. And then you just have your partner character ram into them and break them. And it's just basically the equivalent of putting a lot of empty barrels inside a space. Like, oh, you can smash these, but there's nothing in them. But because there is sometimes something in them, not only are you kind of incentivized to go and click on all of them, it kind of changes your relationship with the space to like a sort of consumptive one. Oh, I'm sorry, little turtle. Yeah, this very consumptive one where you're trying to collect and consume the environment. Very ironic, I think, given its intended message of kind of curbing our consumption and trying to understand the effect our environment is going to have. It takes place in sort of like a post-human world where you can kind of see the undersea remnants of some of these stations. And as it goes on, it does get more interesting. There is a second world that, I think it's the second or third world, where you basically go to the remnants of like SeaWorld, and there's a little part of the city that's been sunken alongside it, which becomes genuinely interesting as a space. And there's a few interesting basic game ideas that I do like, but it's also where they start introducing almost like non-linear Metroid-ish design where you get new abilities to activate new parts, and it just doesn't work. It doesn't really add much. And it takes away from the focus of appreciating the environments. Especially since they feel so limited. It just feels like an excuse to get you to come back to the space later and collect some stuff, which is really unfortunate, because it comes close to one of the arcs that is pretty interesting. And I guess what I'm trying to say with both of these is, if these were less video games and more leaned into the spaces that you could just appreciate as an aesthetic thing, and told their stories, got in and out, I feel like they'd be stronger. I feel like they are adding things because they feel that's what video games do, and because in some ways that's what you have to add to create value as a product, right? They're a little torn between an aesthetic thing and something that needs to be bought and played and given reason to return to. And it feels very hollow and feels very damaging to what they're trying to achieve. And I think there's a lot of people who will see those things and will get exactly the reaction that they intended out of it. It'll give a little dazzle to blind them and distract them from that fact. I don't know if that's true. I don't really run in those kind of circles for obvious reasons. I'm not somebody who is about replay value or any of the other consumer focused ideas of what video games need to be. I really try to look at games as pure art objects, unless they are fundamentally broken, which also sometimes, makes them more interesting art objects. But yeah, if these were just things that you could kind of appreciate the aesthetic, I'm not even like saying take out like all the mechanics, but reconsider them. You reconsider the way you use them. Just littering collectibles around a space is a cheap way to get people to interact with it and to explore it. But it doesn't give you an appreciation for the space, and oftentimes it changes your relationship to it. It makes it something that you consume and that you look forward to consuming rather than you appreciate on its own. Um, and I wish these games would have the confidence to let themselves be aesthetic exercises, let themselves be galleries, be spaces to explore. Um, and I know why they don't, because even in like a world post kind of what you would call the walking sim renaissance, that has allowed explicitly spaces that do that exact thing, right? They're very oh, this song's really nice. They're very I don't want to not complex, but they're very people have very strong reactions in both ways to them, right? There are people who do genuinely love those things, love just aesthetic explorations of places, and there are people who still to this day will look at them and say, this is not a game because I don't get to click on enough things. And the reality of making a commercial product viable is something that, drives people to just add these things without really thinking about them, because that's what a video game is, right? And that's what people enjoy. And I think, again, that's another example of kind of the consumptive, the capitalist limitations on art, the way they kind of like capitalist systems are detrimental to them, because they kind of encourage these kind of things, because without them, people think less of your games by default, right? We don't really have the language, at least in the mainstream way we talk about games. Again, thanks to the way that they've been kind of tied into this consumerist philosophy, like all the ideology. We don't really have the language to describe them as art pieces most of the time. We don't have the language to talk about aesthetics the same way we would do like a painting or something like that. And that's not because you can't use those same terms, but rather that that's not the education that we bring to the way that we talk about games, right? We very much talk about games in that consumerist, product-focused way that I talked about. They can kind of hear me think about and talk about in that Sonic Adventure video that I put up a while back. And again, I guess like every one of these is gonna end with, "Hey, go read some art books," but yeah, go ahead and read some art books. I just don't think those two are specifically very frustrating because of the way that what they draw upon specifically feels antithetical to their themes. It's stuff that directly contradicts what their message, and it makes them worse games because not only because the mechanics themselves are kind of loaded with these ideologies that contradict theirs, but just because they kind of think of them, they don't think of these mechanics as narrative tools, right? They just think of them as things to do separate from the story. They're things to keep your hands busy while you listen to the story being told or something like that, rather than things that, you know, help tell and pace your story. As you know, that which really is something that you should think about. Like specifically for Falcon Age, I think that the way that it breaks up its world and sends you between different parts of the map, which are just largely empty in between, aside from a few like items to collect for crafting or things to hunt, not only does it create a mentality of consumption, because it doesn't really give you anything to do but consume and reuse them, but it also drags down the pacing of the story. It makes the story slower. It keeps the plot points away from you, and it kind of extends it longer than its running time needs to be, even if it's already short. And you in a vacuum, you see why all these decisions are made, right? In a vacuum, I guess it would make sense. If you're the people working on this for however many years of your life and you're trying to get it out, I see why you would make a game like this. And the unfortunate thing is the way that the conditions that art is created in video games often don't allow this kind of radical rethinking of it. It's something you have to plan from the beginning, and if you go off that plan, there is serious consequences for that. You know, delaying a game takes a lot of resources. And sometimes you just need to finish your thing and put it out in a state that you don't want it to be. But also, it's just also really hard. A lot of game designers I talk to, they don't play a lot of games because they don't have the time to. And they don't have the luxury of thinking about games in a kind of more holistic sense. And that's not to say, like, game designers aren't knowledgeable or articulate in the language of games or give it real thought, because they often give it a lot more thought than I think a lot of people give it credit for. Video games are very intentional objects, but it's just hard to get outside of the kind of limited scope of the way we think of games, especially if you only play kind of big titles or a few games here and there, and you don't kind of have the space to go to find alternative approaches or alternative places of thinking. And some of this is by design, right? The stuff that's popular, the way that we talk about things, always comes back to the same kind of philosophies and ideas of the way we think of games. And those are the videos that get promoted. Those are the GDC talks that you see. It's just kind of ingrained, again, in the way that we talk about games and think about games. But it's a shame because I would have really liked the more walking simulator approach to Falcon Age. I would have liked the more Aquanaut's Holiday approach to Jupiter and Mars. Like, to compare them to some other games, Jupiter and Mars, I think they explicitly had one of the visual designers from Child of Eden on it, and you can kind of tell. But one of the things that Child of Eden does that I really like is it tells story very visually. It uses a lot of abstract imagery to tell kind of vague, thematic, sweeping, and emotional narratives without saying anything, without communicating any of it verbally, right? Nobody gives you narration about what these two colored orbs smashing together and coming into conflict and then combining and splitting apart mean, right? You just kind of get it. They just reflect things that you already understand. You know, conflict, love, death, rebirth, those kinds of things. You can kind of see them. All those things. They can kind of vaguely hint at the themes in Child of Eden by just, calling a level beauty, right? And then you're like, oh, okay, so this is beauty. This gives me a framework to think about the imagery that they're presenting here. Jupiter and Mars very much just tells you outright. It's working with very much more concrete images, despite how abstracted all of it is. It's very much like a low poly aesthetic that kind of hints at the shapes of things rather than renders them highly in high detail, which I think works given its limitations and its aims for VR and all that stuff. But then it also just tells you, oh, hey, the mother is grateful to you. The mother turtle's grateful to you for getting all of her children. Or Jupiter and Mars are scared in this very moment. And it's just like, there is like specifically at least one so far moment where it works, but that's only works because it's human narration and not just some text on the screen. And generally every time there is just text on the screen telling you about what's next, it feels unnecessary. It feels like they weren't confident enough that you would get it just by looking at the image. Like I don't really need to know that the big ancient whale looking thing is creating a portal that's going to teleport me to the next world, right? I don't need an explanation for that. You can just do it for me. Just send me there. Let me be in that space, and let me kind of, and it's even a little bit better to let me wonder about that stuff. It kind of just draws more attention to the construction and just like the constructed nature of it, which isn't like inherently bad, but it also distracts from the appreciation of the aesthetics. Another game that I kind of feel, despite all its flaws, kind of worked well with this kind of space is Anamorphine, which I don't think the story it tells is particularly compelling, or that its thematic ideas are like particularly intelligent, but I do think that the way that it handles spaces is confident and smart, and the way that it threads them together without needing to constantly give you language around it. It just kind of shows you the images and trusts that you'll get it. And it doesn't even have an interaction button. You just kind of get near things that have a specific sheen in the environment, and then they'll activate. It doesn't feel any less interactive or anything like that because of it. And it is definitely limited, and you definitely feel the construction of the space and the limits of the space. But I don't really think about that when I'm playing it, because it has no distractions from the space, because it makes it minimal to engage with the space. It just kind of leaves nothing but the visuals and the imagery and the way you move through that space speak for itself, and makes it the focus of your attention. Like I was saying, going back, whenever you put collectibles into space, you immediately make the game about collectibles. And when in something like a platformer, you can kind of use that to direct a player, to give them an objective, right? In Mario, you put a coin to give a hint that this is a place to go. And Sonic, you put a bunch of rings as a reward for saying, hey, nice job climbing to the highest points in here, or staying on the top level of the stage, things like that, right? In a bad Amiga platformer, you just put collectibles everywhere because you have no fucking clue how to create a competent platformer, and you just put stuff in there because it'll add interactivity to a space. Um, I know I dig on Amiga games a lot. Like I kind of understand because just I think Amiga games are like the pinnacle of this. And I am generalizing a lot just because, and I know this is not true for all of them, but there's very much an aesthetic, a love for aesthetics in Amiga games that is not reflected anywhere in the way that the games are actually designed. You know, they make these elaborate demo scene-esque creations, and then they just throw a lot of shit in them so you can shoot them or grab them or whatever, without any care about how that affects the space. Like, a good way to think about constructing these things is think of them as art galleries. Like, all video games are sort of art galleries in a respect, right? They're a collection of materials and stuff that come together, and and not in that they're just static displays or anything like that, but a lot of care gets put into the way gallery spaces are made and museum spaces are made, and the way that they lead you through things in a way to give you a specific story experience, right? If you have a bunch of images, independent, it's a collection of independent images, right? Independent art pieces. If you put those art pieces in an order in front of somebody, somehow it's immediately a story, right? If you put 4 images in a vertical row, it's a 4 coma, right? The act of collecting and organizing something immediately can change it, and that's essentially what art galleries do. And to go wrap back around on the collectibles thing, sometimes things like that are useful in the way that an audio log in a video game can have the same function as an audio tour in an art gallery. It can give you more context to the world, help you understand something that you might not understand without outside help because you haven't read, 20,000 pages of art books, art history. So having, 3 sentences will have you appreciate something in a different way, contextualize it, give you a different interaction with it. And sometimes those are useful, and that's why there are sometimes plaques or audio tours that you can take through a gallery. But imagine if things like that were just everywhere. Imagine if you just had a whole bunch of pages of a book scattered around a space. Say the way Alan Wake does. What if you walked into a gallery and there was a page on top of a shelf somewhere, a page in some closet, peeking out some closet, or just littered on the floor somewhere? You'd immediately become curious what these pages are for, and you'd immediately be distracted from the art, and probably get more focused on picking them up. And I'm not saying that's how everybody interacts with these pages, but that's how having something like that can change the way you interact with it, right? If you put a trail of breadcrumbs, people will look to find out where the trail of breadcrumbs is coming from. That's just the nature of curiosity, and a lot of there is something to be said about kind of the pristine way that art objects are kind of handled in gallery spaces and kind of sanitized in a way. These things are always more complicated than just what I'm saying here, but the reason a lot of spaces do keep the place so clean is because they want you to appreciate those objects, right? They want to create an atmosphere in which you can think about and appreciate those objects. And when you clutter them, when you litter them with random things to interact with, you create distractions. And I kind of want people to think about that a little bit more. I want us to consider what I think I'm not saying that game design should make an art gallery, but I think that looking at art galleries and location specific installations and things like that can give us a kind of idea of what we can do with games, and thinking about how those are intentionally created, we can think about what we intend to invoke in games. I think I'm kind of running to the end of my fuse here. It's about 6:56 now, and I should probably make some food for myself before I go to work. I'm gonna just hang out here for a second. I'm gonna let you appreciate what we've been seeing here. And I'm gonna kind of recommend that you go play Aquanaut's Holiday on its own and appreciate it for what it does. This is a really cool game, by the way. A really cool example of a weird commercial failure, most likely. Definitely a critical one that nonetheless has done a lot of interesting things that a lot of modern games have failed to do. I think it kind of speaks for itself again. But yeah, thanks for joining me again on one of these. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope this is relaxing to you, and I hope that gave you a different way to think about games, or just spaces and art and the way you interact with things in general. This is Amr, signing off. Peace.